The forest was so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground where Tansy Aspinall stood, calling out names that hadn't left her lips in 15 years. The Gabonese jungle pressed in from all sides, a wall of green that swallowed sound and made every footstep uncertain. Her guide, a local tracker named Michelle, watched nervously as this British woman in her 50s walked deeper into territory where wild gorillas ruled, where humans were intruders, where a 400-pound silverback could emerge without warning and charge before you had time to understand you were about to die. But Tansy wasn't afraid. She was calling for someone she had loved more than most humans she had known, someone she had raised from infancy, someone she had been forced to leave behind 15 years ago when conservation ethics demanded that love surrender to nature's claim. She was calling for Djalta, and against every rational expectation, she believed he would remember her. The rustling started before she saw him. Branches moved in patterns too deliberate to be wind, too heavy to be anything smaller than what she was looking for. Michelle grabbed her arm, whispering urgently that they should back away, that approaching gorillas was madness, that wild silverbacks were unpredictable and dangerous. But Tansy stood her ground, heart pounding, eyes scanning the dense vegetation, waiting for a face she had last seen when it belonged to a confused 5-year-old gorilla being released into this very forest. When Djalta stepped into the small clearing, Tansy's breath caught in her throat. He was massive, easily 400 pounds of pure muscle, with the distinctive silver saddle across his back that marked him as a mature male in his prime. His face had changed, broadened with age and dominance, scarred from battles with rival males, hardened by 15 years of survival in one of the world's most challenging environments. He looked nothing like the baby she remembered. Yet when their eyes met across 20 feet of jungle floor, Tansy knew him instantly. And impossibly, miraculously, he knew her too. Djalta's body language shifted from alert wariness to something that made Michelle gasp in disbelief. The massive silverback moved forward with deliberate gentleness, vocalizing soft grunts that gorillas use to communicate reassurance within their family groups. He approached Tansy directly, stopping just inches away, and reached out one enormous hand to touch her face with a tenderness that contradicted everything his size and power suggested he was capable of. But what happened next would become one of the most documented and debated moments in primate research history. After establishing that Tansy was real, was truly the human he remembered from a lifetime ago, Djalta did something that gorillas simply do not do with humans outside of captivity. He turned back toward the forest and made a specific vocalization, a call that brought 2 female gorillas and 3 small infants cautiously into the clearing. Djalta positioned himself between his family and Tansy, then deliberately stepped aside and gestured, using body language that seemed to communicate introduction. He was bringing his family to meet the woman who had raised him. He was saying, in the only language he possessed, that this human was safe, was important, was part of something that transcended the normal boundaries between species. And as Tansy knelt in the dirt while infant gorillas climbed onto her lap, and Djalta's mate cautiously approached to examine this strange human her partner trusted so completely, everyone present understood they were witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about memory, emotion, and the bonds that can form between humans and wild animals. To understand how this impossible moment came to exist, you need to go back to 1986, to a baby gorilla orphaned by poachers in the forests of Cameroon, and to a young British conservationist who made a decision that would define both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Tansy Aspinall came from a family of unusual conservationists. Her father, John Aspinall, was a controversial figure who had founded private zoos in England with a philosophy that emphasized deep personal bonds between keepers and animals, rather than the distant, purely scientific approach that dominated traditional zoology. Critics called his methods dangerous and anthropomorphic. Supporters recognized him as someone who understood that animals were individuals, not specimens, and that treating them with respect and affection often produced better welfare outcomes than treating them as subjects for detached study. Tansy had grown up surrounded by animals that most people only saw behind barriers. She had learned from childhood that gorillas, despite their fearsome reputation and enormous strength, were gentle, intelligent, deeply emotional beings capable of forming complex social bonds and demonstrating behaviors that looked remarkably like love, grief, humor, and empathy. When the call came that an infant gorilla had been confiscated from poachers and needed immediate care, Tansy volunteered without hesitation, despite having no formal training in primate rehabilitation. Djalta was approximately 6 months old when Tansy first held him, small enough to fit in her arms, but already showing the distinctive features that would mark him as a Western lowland gorilla. He had been traumatized by capture, by the loss of his mother who had been killed so poachers could steal her baby, and by the rough handling of illegal traffickers who saw him as nothing more than valuable contraband. He was malnourished, dehydrated, and psychologically shattered in ways that went beyond physical injury. The first weeks were critical and heartbreaking. Djalta would not eat, would not respond to comfort, would sit motionless for hours in the same posture of despair that captive gorillas sometimes adopt when trauma overwhelms their ability to cope. Tansy spent every day with him, holding him constantly, talking to him in soft tones, recreating as much as possible the physical contact and reassurance that an infant gorilla would receive from its mother in the wild. She learned to read his subtle signals, to understand what the slight changes in his vocalizations meant, to provide exactly the right response when he needed comfort versus when he needed gentle encouragement to engage with his environment. The breakthrough came on day 17, when Djalta reached up and touched Tansy's face for the first time. It was the gesture that infant gorillas use to explore their mother's features, to confirm identity and seek reassurance through tactile contact. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. Djalta had accepted Tansy as his surrogate mother, had decided that this human who smelled nothing like a gorilla and looked nothing like his species could nevertheless fill the terrible void that his real mother's death had created. Trust, once established, grew rapidly. Within weeks, Djalta was eating normally, playing with increasing confidence, and demonstrating the curious, mischievous personality that would characterize his entire relationship with Tansy. The years that followed created a bond that everyone who witnessed it recognized as a genuine maternal attachment. Tansy became Djalta's entire world, and he became central to hers. She taught him everything she could about being a gorilla, despite being human herself. She showed him how to build sleeping nests from vegetation, how to recognize which plants were edible, how to navigate trees and develop the strength and coordination he would need for wild survival. She introduced him to other young gorillas at the sanctuary, encouraging social play and the rough and tumble interactions that taught young gorillas their place in dominance hierarchies and social structures. But more than teaching skills, Tansy provided emotional security that allowed Djalta's personality to flourish. He became confident, playful, remarkably gentle despite his increasing strength. By age 2, he weighed over 60 pounds and could easily have hurt Tansy during their play sessions, but he demonstrated extraordinary control, adjusting his strength when interacting with his human mother in ways that suggested conscious awareness of her physical vulnerability. By age 4, he was over 100 pounds, beginning the transition toward adolescence, showing the first hints of the massive bulk he would eventually achieve. Throughout these years, Tansy documented everything. She kept detailed notes on Djalta's development, his behavioral milestones, his social interactions, his health. She photographed and filmed their daily routines, creating a record that would eventually contribute to scientific understanding of gorilla cognitive development. But the documentation was never purely scientific. The video showed moments of pure affection, of play that made both gorilla and human laugh, of quiet companionship where Djalta would simply sit with Tansy, content to be near her while she worked or read or simply existed in shared space. Visitors to the sanctuary were often stunned by what they witnessed. Djalta would greet Tansy with enthusiastic vocalizations when she arrived each morning, would follow her everywhere, would bring her objects or initiate games that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of turn-taking and playful deception. He clearly distinguished Tansy from other humans, showing preferences and attachment behaviors toward her that he did not display with anyone else. The bond was unmistakable, deep and mutual in ways that challenged any claim that animals could not form genuine emotional attachments to humans. But everyone involved knew that this relationship had an expiration date. The ultimate goal was not to keep Djalta in captivity, but to return him to the wild, to give him the opportunity to live as nature intended, as a free gorilla in African forests with his own kind. The Aspinall Foundation had pioneered guerrilla reintroduction programs in Gabon, creating protocols for releasing captive-raised gorillas into protected reserves where they could establish territories and integrate into wild populations. It was revolutionary, controversial, and desperately necessary work, given that gorilla populations were plummeting due to poaching and habitat destruction. As Djalta approached 5 years old, the decision could no longer be postponed. He was becoming too large, too strong, too much a wild animal living in constrained circumstances. His adolescence was approaching, a period when male gorillas naturally leave their natal groups and either join bachelor groups or eventually establish their own territories. Keeping him in England would mean a life in captivity, in enclosures, removed from everything his evolution had prepared him for. The ethical choice, the loving choice, was to let him go. The preparation for release took months. Djalta was gradually introduced to other gorillas who would be released with him, forming a small group that could provide social support during the transition to wild living. He was moved to larger, more naturalistic enclosures that reduced his habituation to human structures and routines. Contact with Tansy was systematically decreased, painful as it was for both of them, to reduce his dependency on her presence and support. The actual separation was one of the most difficult experiences of Tansy's life. She accompanied Djalta to Gabon, staying with him through the final stages of pre-release preparation, knowing that once he entered the forest, she would never see him again. Gorilla reintroduction programs did not include ongoing human contact. The entire point was to give these animals genuine wild lives, and that meant humans becoming irrelevant to their existence. On the day of release, Tansy walked with Djalta to the edge of the forest. He seemed to understand something significant was happening, showing uncharacteristic nervousness, staying close to her, repeatedly touching her face and hands in what looked like requests for reassurance. When the moment came for Tansy to step back and let local guides lead Djalta into the forest with his release group, he resisted, vocalizing distress, looking back at her with eyes that seemed to ask why she was abandoning him. Tansy forced herself to remain still, to not follow, to let him go despite every instinct screaming that she should keep this being she loved safe under her protection. She watched until the forest swallowed him completely, until the sounds of the release group faded into the general cacophony of jungle life, until there was nothing left but the empty space where her purpose had existed for 5 years. Then she returned to England, returned to her normal life, and tried to accept that Djalta was gone forever. 15 years passed. Tansy continued working in conservation, supporting the Aspinall Foundation's programs, helping other orphaned gorillas through the early stages before they went to Gabon for release preparation. She followed general reports about the reintroduction program's success, knowing that several gorillas, including Djalta, had survived and established themselves in the forest, but she had no specific information about him as an individual. The program discouraged attempts to track or observe specific animals, wanting them to live without human interference. But in 2005, when Tansy learned that a research team would be conducting a census of the reintroduced gorilla population, she asked to join the expedition. She told herself it was professional interest, a desire to see firsthand how the program had succeeded. But she knew the truth. She wanted to know what had happened to Djalta, wanted to see if he had survived, if he had found a family, if he had achieved the wildlife she had sacrificed their bond to give him. The Gabonese forest was exactly as she remembered it, dense and humid and teeming with life that paid no attention to human concerns. The research team warned Tansy that finding specific individuals would be nearly impossible. The reintroduced gorillas had dispersed across vast territories, had integrated into the forest in ways that made them difficult to distinguish from wild-born animals. Moreover, approaching them was dangerous. These were not the habituated gorillas that tourists saw in controlled viewing situations. These were wild animals, and wild silverbacks were unpredictable, potentially aggressive, capable of inflicting serious injury on humans who violated their space. But Tansy insisted on trying. She asked Michelle, the local tracker, to take her to the territories where the original release group had been documented. And when they reached a promising area, she did something that everyone told her was foolish. She started calling the names of the gorillas she had known 15 years ago, using the specific vocalization she had developed with Djalta during their years together. sounds that meant nothing to wild gorillas, but that might, impossibly, still mean something to a silverback who had once been a confused infant clinging to a human mother. When Djalta emerged from the forest and recognized her, when he approached with gentleness rather than threat, when he touched her face in the same gesture he had used as an infant, Tansy understood that the bond they had formed had not been temporary or superficial. He had carried her in his memory for 15 years, had retained emotional attachment that survived a decade and a half of wild living, of experiences and relationships and challenges that should have overwritten any connection to the human who had raised him. But the true revelation came when Djalta turned and called his family from the forest. The two adult females who emerged were his mates, partners he had attracted through the complex courtship and dominance displays that male gorillas use to establish relationships. The three infants were his children, babies he was raising in exactly the way his own mother would have raised him before poachers destroyed his original family. He had achieved everything the reintroduction program hoped for: survival, social integration, reproduction, successful adaptation to wild living, and yet some part of him had never forgotten the human who had saved him, had given him the emotional foundation and social skills that made this wild success possible. Now, incredibly, he was sharing this success with her, bringing his most precious relationships to meet the being who represented his deepest early attachment. It was behavior that demanded explanation, that challenged assumptions about what gorillas were capable of remembering and why they might choose to maintain connections that served no obvious survival purpose. The scientific implications were profound. Dr. Magdalena Bermejo, a primatologist who had studied wild gorillas for decades, reviewed the video footage of the encounter and called it one of the most significant documented cases of long-term memory and cross-species attachment in great apes. Gorillas were known to have excellent memory, to recognize individuals after years of separation, to maintain complex social bonds within their own species. But this was different. This was a wild silverback deliberately introducing his human foster mother to his wild-born family, demonstrating trust and attachment that had survived 15 years without any reinforcement or contact. The encounter also raised questions about what gorillas understood about relationships and identity. Did Djalta think of Tansy as another gorilla? Or did he recognize her as human but categorize her as family regardless of species? When he brought his infants to her, was he teaching them that this particular human was safe? Or was he doing something more complex, something that looked like pride in showing Tansy what he had achieved? Look at my family. Look at what I have built with the life you gave me. What made the story even more remarkable was that the interaction was not a one-time occurrence. Over the following 10 years, Tansy returned to Gabon multiple times, and each visit followed a similar pattern. Djalta would emerge from the forest when he heard her calling, would greet her with obvious recognition and affection, and would bring his family group to interact with her under his protective supervision. As his family grew, as new babies were born, Djalta consistently introduced each infant to Tansy, creating a multi-generational recognition of this specific human as someone significant and trustworthy. Dr. Tara Stowinski, president of the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, studied documentation of these repeated encounters and concluded that they represented genuine relationship maintenance across species boundaries. Djalta was not simply responding to Tansy's presence with curiosity or remembered habituation. He was actively choosing to sustain a connection with her, investing time and energy in maintaining a bond that held emotional rather than survival value. His willingness to bring his infants into contact with a human, something that wild gorillas almost never permit, demonstrated extraordinary trust based on experiences from a lifetime ago. The infants' responses were equally fascinating. They showed natural wariness of Tansy initially, as any wild gorilla infant would toward a human. But with Djalta's reassurance conveyed through vocalizations and body positioning that communicated safety, the babies would gradually approach, investigating this strange creature with the fearless curiosity that young primates display in secure environments. Some would climb on Tansy, pulling her hair, examining her hands, engaging in the same exploratory play they used with their mothers and siblings. They were learning that this particular human was different from other humans. that she belonged in some category that made her acceptable within their social sphere. This cultural transmission of information about a specific human across gorilla generations was unprecedented in primate research. It suggested that gorillas possessed not just individual memory, but the capacity to teach social knowledge to offspring, creating traditions that persisted beyond single lifetimes. Djalta was essentially telling his children, this human is family, she can be trusted, and they were accepting this information and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The broader implications extended to conservation philosophy and practice. Traditional approaches emphasize complete separation between wild animals and humans, treating any ongoing relationship as habituation that compromised wild integrity. But Jalta's story suggested that relationships formed during necessary rehabilitation might not inevitably harm wild success. He had become fully wild, had achieved everything that nature intended for a gorilla, while simultaneously maintaining an emotional connection to the human who had saved him. The two states were not mutually exclusive. This realization influenced how the Aspinall Foundation and other organizations approach reintroduction programs. Perhaps the goal should not be to erase all memory of human care, but to establish foundations of trust and emotional security that actually enhanced wild survival. Animals raised with genuine affection and respect might develop confidence and social skills that serve them better than animals raised with clinical detachment. The bond between Tansy and Djalta suggested that love and successful conservation were not opposites but potentially complementary forces. As years passed, Tansy watched Djalta age into a magnificent silverback, the dominant male of his territory, father to multiple offspring, living exactly the life that gorilla evolution had designed him for. She saw his children grow into adolescence, some leaving to establish their own territories or join other groups as natural gorilla social dynamics dictated. She watched Jalta's interactions with his mates, seeing the gentle patience he displayed with them, wondering if some of that gentleness had been learned during his years with a human foster mother who had never raised her voice or hand in anger, who had taught through affection rather than dominance. The question of what Djalta felt during these encounters remained ultimately unknowable. Scientists could observe behavior, measure hormone responses, document social interactions, but could not access the subjective experience of being a gorilla remembering a human across years and choosing to maintain connection. Did he experience something analogous to what humans call love? Did memories of Tansy bring him comfort during difficult times in the forest? Did he think of her when he interacted with his own children, drawing on learned behaviors from his time with her? These questions touched on fundamental mysteries of consciousness and emotion across species. The fact that they could even be seriously asked represented a shift in how science approached animal minds. 50 years ago, researchers would have dismissed such questions as anthropomorphic fantasy, imposing human experiences onto animals incapable of such complexity. But contemporary primatology, informed by decades of field observation and cognitive research, recognized that great apes possessed rich inner lives, complex emotional experiences, and cognitive capacities that demanded serious consideration rather than dismissive skepticism. In 2024, as Tansy approached her 70s and Djalta entered his late 30s, their story continued. The most recent encounter, filmed by a BBC documentary crew, showed an aging silverback and an aging human woman meeting in the forest for what both seemed to understand might be one of their final times together. Djalta moved more slowly now, showing the stiffness that comes with age, but his recognition of Tansy was immediate and unmistakable. He brought his adolescent children and newest infant to meet her, maintaining the tradition that had spanned nearly 4 decades. Watching the footage, observers could see something profound in Jalta's eyes when he looked at Tansy, something that transcended simple recognition and moved into territory that looked remarkably like tenderness, like memory of a time when he was small and frightened, and she was everything safe in a terrifying world. And in Tansy's eyes, watching this magnificent wild silverback who had once been her baby, there was pride and love and sadness for the passage of time that brought all relationships eventually toward endings. The legacy of their story extends far beyond one woman and one gorilla. It has influenced how conservationists approach rehabilitation, how researchers study primate cognition and emotion, how the public understands the capacity of animals for memory and attachment. It provides evidence that bonds formed in rescue and care can coexist with wild success, that love given freely to an orphaned animal might return in forms more precious than anyone could predict. Perhaps most importantly, Djalta and Tansy's relationship challenges the boundaries humans draw between themselves and other species. If a gorilla can remember a human for 15 years, can choose to maintain that relationship, can introduce his children to her, as if saying this being matters to me, and therefore should matter to you, then consciousness and emotion are not uniquely human possessions, but part of a broader spectrum of sentience that we share with our closest evolutionary relatives. Every time Djalta brought another infant to meet Tansy, he was teaching that infant something profound, that some connections transcend species, that trust once earned should be honored, and that family is not defined solely by blood or biology, but by the bonds we choose to maintain across time and distance and all the changes that life brings. It was a lesson that humans, watching from outside the forest, desperately needed to learn from a gorilla who somehow understood it intuitively, who lived it through his actions, who demonstrated that loyalty and love are not human inventions, but ancient capacities that predate our species and extend throughout the family of life to which we all belong. If this story touched you, if it changed how you see the boundaries between human and animal consciousness, if it reminded you that memory and love exist in forms we are only beginning to understand, then share it with others who need to know that we are not alone in our capacity for deep emotional bonds. Subscribe to Wildlife Tales for more documented stories about animal intelligence and the relationships that prove consciousness is not uniquely human, but distributed throughout the living world. Turn on notifications so you never miss stories that expand our understanding of who deserves moral consideration and respect. And if you ever doubt that animals remember, that they form genuine attachments, that they carry us in their hearts across years and distances, remember Djalta, the gorilla who spent 15 years in wild African forests but never forgot the human who saved him, who raised him, and who loved him enough to let him go so he could become everything nature intended him to be.